Great. Can everyone see my presentation?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you everyone who's on the call today for giving up a Saturday morning to listen to an update of some of the news since I last presented to you in August. Unfortunately, that last presentation wasn't recorded, so Peter wanted me to go over a little bit of the ground that I covered back in August, but most of the information I'm going to show you today is going to be new. So just a brief update. I've been involved with the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, the IPCC, for over 35 years now, since the first report back in 1990. As I mentioned last time in August, that first report essentially concluded that the jury was out, that it was too early to tell in 1990 whether there was or was not a human signal in the climate system. Fast forward 5 years to the second IPCC report in 1995, and a very different conclusion was reached. These infamous 12 words: the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate. It wasn't eureka, there's water in the bathtub, we understand everything. It was cautious, even wimpy. The balance of evidence suggests. Nevertheless, it was the first time that the international scientific community formally declared that they could identify a human-caused climate change signal. It had risen above the background noise of natural climate variability. And as I and others have recounted, a lot of powerful individuals, organizations, and even countries, think Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, didn't like that finding back in 1995. And I've spent the intervening 30 years since then defending that finding, explaining the process by which it had been reached, and also explaining the scientific underpinning. What was the nature of the evidence back then that allowed us to reach that finding? Subsequent IPCC reports in 2001, in 2007, 2013, upped the ante and came to much more definitive conclusions about the reality of human effects on climate. They introduced this so-called calibrated likelihood language and went from most of the warming observed over the last 50 years is due to us to very likely to extremely likely in 2013 to unequivocal in the most recent IPCC assessment in 2021. It's now unequivocal that there are human fingerprints all over the climate system, in the atmosphere, in the ocean, on the land surface, in literally dozens of different climate variables. So this is the arc of history over the last 35 years, the arc of scientific understanding. And I would argue that one of the drivers of this trajectory has been fingerprinting, the use of pattern recognition methods to disentangle human and natural effects on global climate. And for me, this fingerprinting, journey in fingerprinting started with a paper that was published in 1967 by this gentleman, Suki Manabe, and his colleague, Richard Weatherald. Then Suki and Dick were both at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab in Princeton, one of the premier institutions in the world for computer modeling of the climate system, an institution that is now imperiled. Manabe and Weatherald, in this paper in 1967, used a very simple climate model. a so-called radiative convective model that just looked at global mean temperature from the surface right up to the stratosphere, over 45 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And this simple model had a lot of basic physics in it. It represented convection. It represented how greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide interact with incoming solar radiation and with outgoing heat from the Earth's surface. And in this simple model, Manabe and Weatherald increased CO2 in the atmosphere of the model from 150 to 300 to 600 parts per million. And when they did that, they observed this curious phenomenon that the lower atmosphere, the troposphere, warmed. It more effectively trapped heat with more CO2 in the atmosphere. And over 75% of the mass of the atmosphere is in the troposphere. And the upper atmosphere cooled the stratosphere. And that cooling signal, as you can see here, was predicted to become larger the higher up you got above the Earth's surface. This was my starting point. I wanted to look for this predicted fingerprint in observations of climate change. First, in weather balloon measurements of atmospheric temperature change, and later in these beautiful satellite measurements of atmospheric temperature change. These measurements are now also imperiled, just like the geophysical fluid dynamics lab. There are powerful individuals who seek to turn off satellites and prevent us from gaining this kind of understanding that you see here. So what do you see here? These are measurements of the microwave emissions from oxygen molecules. And those microwave emissions depend on the temperature of different broad layers of the atmosphere. Satellites that carry so-called microwave sounding units measure these microwave emissions at different frequencies and provide us with this kind of information. This shows you temperature trends in a slice through the Earth's atmosphere from 1986, the beginning of continuous measurements, through to near present, the end of 2024. And what you see is exactly what Manabe and Weatherald predicted over 55 years ago. Cooling of the stratosphere, with cooling getting larger the higher up you go above the Earth's surface. Warming of the troposphere. The largest warming is over the Arctic, where we've seen a roughly 50% decrease in the extent of Arctic sea ice in response to warming. And that decrease in bright reflective sea ice amplifies warming. It's a so-called feedback effect that acts to enhance the warming caused by CO2. That's why you see this hot spot here over the Arctic. So to first order, this observational evidence of warming low down and cooling up high is consistent with what Manabe and Weatherald predicted. Again, Manabe and Weatherald used a very simple climate model back in 1967. What do state-of-the-art models tell us today about the response of the temperature structure of Earth's atmosphere to increases in CO2? These are results from 9 different state-of-the-art climate models, and they show, again, what Manabe and Weatherald predicted: warming of the lower atmosphere, cooling of the upper atmosphere, and here in this final panel are the satellite data, again, showing this distinctive pattern of warming low down, cooling up high. The important thing is that no natural processes can generate this. Let me repeat that. No natural processes, natural changes in the sun's energy output, natural changes in volcanic aerosols in the atmosphere, natural internal changes in the climate system associated with El Niños, La Niñas, and other purely intrinsic changes internal to the climate system. Nothing natural can do this. Only human-caused increases in CO2 and other heat-trapping gases and human-caused depletion of ozone in the stratosphere can produce this distinctive fingerprint. We've shown that is the case, that natural phenomena can't explain what you see in the satellite data in papers that go back to 1996. Our first paper, motivated by Manabe and Weatherald, was published in the journal Nature in 1996. Our most recent paper was published just a few months ago in PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Perhaps one of the vertical fingerprints that we've done recently that has received most attention has been this one. It was published 2 years ago in 2023, and it extended vertical fingerprinting from the surface to 50 kilometers above the surface. Prior to this paper in 2023, most of our fingerprint work had only gone into the lower stratosphere, from about 20 to 25 kilometers above the Earth's surface. This one extended fingerprinting way up to 50 kilometers above the surface, and this was our bottom line finding. Extending fingerprinting to the upper stratosphere with long temperature records and improved climate models means that it is now virtually impossible for natural causes to explain satellite-measured trends in the thermal structure of the Earth's atmosphere. Peter mentioned this report commissioned by Chris Wright, the Secretary of the Department of Energy, and released at the end of July 2025. What does the DOE report say about vertical fingerprinting? And before getting into what they say, let me just declare up front that the DOE report actually cites this 2023 paper that I just showed you. So they reference it, and here's what they say. A combination of tropospheric warming and stratospheric cooling is a commonly cited fingerprint of anthropogenic climate change. Stratospheric warming since 2000 coincides with continued surface and tropospheric warming, a pattern that is not found in climate model simulations and is not apparently consistent with the anthropogenic fingerprint. Let me highlight a couple of things here. First of all, they're claiming that there is stratospheric warming, not cooling, but warming since 2000. And they are saying that there's a fundamental inconsistency between climate models and observations. Despite what I just showed you in that postage stamp figure showing 9 state-of-the-art climate models that all show over the period of satellite observations, warming of the troposphere and cooling of the stratosphere. The DOE report is saying that Santer et al. In our 2023 paper say they found a fingerprint of human effects on climate, but they didn't really. So what's the story here? Let's look at this claim first. Stratospheric warming since 2000. What you see in blue here, I'd like you to focus on that first, are satellite measurements of the temperature of the stratosphere for 3 different broad layers, from 25 to 35 kilometers above the Earth's surface, a little higher up, and then from 40 to 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. These are global mean temperature changes from 1986 through to the end of 2024. And again, focus on the blue lines first. They show this very large cooling signal. And as predicted by Manabe and Weatherald in 1967, the cooling gets larger the higher up you go into the stratosphere. Here, for example, again, if you look at the blue line, the cooling is nearly 2 degrees Celsius over this 39-year period. It's a huge signal. You can see that there are these nice ripples in the blue line. Those are due to the roughly 11-year solar cycle. So the sun's energy output varies on a timescale of roughly 11 years. There are also longer timescale fluctuations, but this 11-year solar cycle is one that we've measured very well from space using a variety of spaceborne instruments. And during what's called solar maximum, you have the maximum total solar irradiance, as it's called. And during solar minimum, these these low valleys here, you have the minimum solar output from the sun. So that's what this ripple effect here is in the blue line. And this thing here, this peak that you see, is the warming effect from a big eruption in the Philippines in June 1991, the eruption of Mount Pinatubo. When a big eruption like Pinatubo injects sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, it warms the stratosphere, and that's what you see here. The black line and the individual gray lines are from those model simulations, from the 9 different state-of-the-art climate models I showed you earlier, models that are run with human-caused increases in CO2 and human-caused depletion of stratospheric ozone. The kicker from this figure, if you don't even need to do any complex statistics to look at this, is that there is no stratospheric warming after 2000. The stratosphere continues to cool as predicted by Manabe and Weatherald, as shown in all the climate models. So how can the DOE report be claiming that the stratosphere is warming since 2000? How can they even be doing that? Well, let's look at that. They are ignoring the slide I just showed you. So they're ignoring the very large cooling of the mid to upper stratosphere from 25 to 50 kilometers above the surface. And although they don't say this really explicitly, they're looking at the lower stratosphere where there has not been much cooling since 2000. Again, you can see in blue the satellite measurements of stratospheric temperature change, and in black, the model simulations, which also do not show in the lower stratosphere much warming since 2000. Well, why is that? Why do both the satellite data and the models show very large warming of the middle to upper stratosphere from 25 to 50 kilometers, but very little temperature change after 2000 in the lowermost stratosphere? The answer is this. The answer is ozone. And the answer, in a sense, is one of humanity's success stories. This is a paper that was published in Science in 2016 by my colleague and friend, Susan Solomon at MIT, arguably the world expert on ozone depletion. Susan and her colleagues looked at the size of the ozone hole over Antarctica. And what I'd like you to focus on are these black dots here. These are observations from a couple of different instruments of ozone, and they enable you to track the size of the ozone hole as a function of time. With human-caused production of ozone-depleting substances like chlorofluorocarbons, the ozone hole got bigger in the 70s and 1980s until the Montreal Protocol to limit the production of these ozone-depleting substances began to really bite. And what happened then, after the Montreal Protocol and after it and its successor amendments began to reduce concentrations of ozone-depleting substances, was that the ozone hole began to heal. And Susan was the first one to describe this healing. Again, a scientific success story, a partnership between industry and scientists and politicians. And it's that recovery of ozone that has led to little or no change in the lowermost stratosphere, where most stratospheric ozone resides. So this is interesting and complex science. Temperature changes at different levels of the atmosphere are driven by different things. Models and observations, as I just showed you, both in the lower stratosphere and also higher up, are in good agreement, contrary to the false statements made in the Department of Energy report. What was so troubling to me about this report was that our own careful long-term research was fundamentally misrepresented. The best way I can describe this is if I look out of my kitchen window, it's daytime, beautiful sunlight, beautiful ponderosa pines out there. Imagine someone trying to convince you, no, that's not daylight. It's actually night outside. That's the scientific equivalent of what the DOE report was trying to do in terms of its discussion of vertical fingerprinting. So other areas of concern in the DOE report, there are many. You can go and read them. I'll just give you one more particularly egregious misrepresentation of scientific understanding that relates to extreme events, that relates to heat waves. And this is from a scientist at UCLA, Karen McKinnon, and her group. You may remember that after the Pacific Northwest heat wave, there was this extraordinary warming in the Pacific Northwest, off the charts, 3 to 5 degrees greater than any temperatures that had been measured before observationally. And Karen's research on trying to understand this Pacific Northwest heat wave is misrepresented in the DOE report. So the DOE report cites one of her papers and claims that greenhouse gas emissions have had little to no effect on heat waves for the US. This is what Karen then posted on LinkedIn about that incorrect claim in the DOE report. So after the 2021 heat wave, she and her colleagues tried to understand its likelihood, given that 115 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures in Portland, Oregon, were not on anyone's bingo card. And what they did in their analysis was, first of all, they removed the human-caused warming signal of roughly 3 degrees Fahrenheit in the Pacific Northwest since 1960. So there's this huge warming signal. And in order to try and look at the question of whether atmospheric circulation changes alone, in the absence of this profound human-caused warming signal, could have generated the Pacific Northwest heat wave, they first subtracted 3 degrees warming since 1960. Here's what they found. After accounting for those 3 degrees Fahrenheit, the extreme heat conditions were unlikely, but not impossible, based on an ensemble of climate model simulations. As scientists, this supported the simplest hypothesis that the region has warmed due to climate change, and then we had some bad luck in the weather that led to the very extreme event. The DOE report said this. They only included the following quote from the McKinnon et al. Peer-reviewed published paper. The most likely explanation remains that the weather event itself was bad luck. As Karen points out, when taken out of context, this quote fails to reflect the reality, which is that the weather event occurred against a warmer baseline, leading to a hotter and longer heat wave. So again, this is a fundamental misrepresentation and cherry picking of peer-reviewed published results. How can something like this even happen? And as Karen points out, the reason it happens is that this is intentionally misleading because the DOE report serves to buttress the efforts of the Environmental Protection Agency to rescind the 2009 endangerment finding, the finding that greenhouse gases cause a threat to human health and welfare. So let me give you a brief update. What has happened in terms of the DOE report since I last spoke to you? The report itself was released on July the 29th. It was commissioned by Secretary of Energy Chris Wright. The 5 authors, as has been widely reported, are noted climate change skeptics. I've dealt with them for much of the last 30 years. The report is released simultaneously with a press conference by EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin, who announced a proposed rule to rescind the 2009 endangerment finding. And in that proposed rule, the DOE report is referenced 16 times as evidence that climate change science is unsettled science, that it isn't really mature, well understood science. The EPA proposed rule then on August the 1st was published in the Federal Register. The EPA solicited public comments. I believe that when the comment period ended on September the 22nd, over 500,000 comments had been received. On August the 7th, as Peter mentioned, the U.S. National Academies, not only of science, but also engineering and medicine, announced a fast-tracked review of, quote, the latest scientific evidence on whether greenhouse gas emissions are reasonably anticipated to endanger public health and welfare in the U.S. The review was led by Shirley Tillman, a past president of Princeton University. On August the 12th, the Environmental Defense Fund and the Union of Concerned Scientists sued the EPA, the Department of Energy, Chris Wright, Lee Zeldin, and the authors of the DOE report. They challenged the Trump administration's use of a secretively convened group of climate skeptics to prepare a now widely disparaged report in its attempt to undo the endangerment finding. And they sued on these grounds. They argued that the DOE had contravened Federal Advisory Committee rules by secretly putting together a group of people, these 5 noted skeptics, without going through formal advisory commission process. On September the 2nd, a group of 85 climate scientists led by Andy Dessler from Texas A&M University and Robert Kopp at Rutgers University submitted over 400 pages of technical comments on the DOE report. They went through every page and submitted comments pretty much on every page of the original 130-page DOE report. In the words of Dessler, the DOE report was a mockery of science. On September the 3rd, James Comer, the head of the very powerful House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, launched an investigation of the national academies and called the National Academy's fast-track review of climate science a blatant partisan act to undermine the Trump administration. It is not. It is a response of the national academies to the request by the Environmental Protection Agency for comment on the proposed rule to rescind the endangerment finding. The National Academy was well within its rights, and indeed, that's its purpose, to comment on important scientific matters. They provided input, and it seems like Mr. Comer's investigation will not go anywhere, but of course he can cause a lot of harm and trouble to the national academies. Also on September the 3rd, the Department of Energy's Climate Working Group was disbanded. In part, folks believe, in response to the lawsuit against the DOE EPA that is mentioned above. But critically, the report itself was not withdrawn. It's still out there. And just finally, to end this timeline, on September the 17th, the fast track review was released. Its bottom line finding was this: EPA's 2009 finding that the human-caused emissions of greenhouse gases threaten human health and welfare was accurate, has stood the test of time, and is now reinforced by even stronger evidence. So a very, very clear statement. And I'm just so delighted that the national academies were not cowed by Chairman Comer or by others. They assessed the post-2009 science. They found that the science of climate change is credible and that we have no grounds, no scientific grounds for rescinding the endangerment finding. Moving on now to other news, a serial presenter. This is me testifying in front of Congress, in front of the now defunct House Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming, and Attorney General of the U.S. Pam Bondi. So what is this? What is this news? Here's another brief timeline explaining the interconnection between myself and Attorney General Bondi. Back in December of 2020, I received an email, this is during COVID, from the National Academies, and I was invited to speak at a virtual workshop entitled Emerging Areas of Science, Engineering, and Medicine for the Courts. The goal of the workshop was, quote, to identify areas of science, technology, and medicine that may be candidates for new chapters in a proposed update to the Reference Manual on Scientific Evidence. The reference manual is a primary reference source for federal judges on questions of science and litigation. That workshop took place on February the 24th, 2021. It involved a handful of climate scientists and judges. It was open to the public. On May the 11th, 2021, I was invited to give a similar presentation to the National Judicial College. I did. Shortly after that second presentation, on May the 14th, 2021, a Freedom of Information Act request was issued to the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration, NNSA. They're the entity that manage Lawrence Livermore National Lab, where I worked at the time, for the US Department of Energy. And the request was for all email correspondence related to these two presentations. The request was from an organization called Energy Policy Advocates, EPA. And before receiving any responsive information from these Freedom of Information Act requests, EPA on their public-facing website posted defamatory material about me, and this was under the following headline: EPA requests records showing how federal employees gave biased presentations on climate litigation to federal judges. I wasn't a Fed. I've never been a federal employee, so that's wrong. My presentation wasn't about climate litigation. It was about climate fingerprinting. It was about exactly the same evidence that I presented to you today. On September the 30th, 2021, I retired from Lawrence Livermore National Lab. The Freedom of Information requests to the lab continued related to these two presentations. Recently, after I spoke to you 3 months ago, a letter from Power the Future was sent to Attorney General Pam Bondi. Power the Future is an organization that self-describes as a nonprofit dedicated to ensuring robust public understanding about U.S. energy policy and security. The letter refers to me by name multiple times as a serial presenter, not a serial rapist, not a serial criminal, but a serial presenter on climate science to U.S. judges, and asks Attorney General Bondi to investigate. On August the 18th, 2025, I was contacted by Fox News. They had reported on the letter to Attorney General Bondi. They had actually reported multiple times on this issue of people like me speaking to judges. And Fox News requested my reaction. Here's what I provided to them. As of today, US climate scientists still have the freedom to educate US citizens on the reality and seriousness of climate change. I cherish that freedom. While it still exists, I intend to continue serving as a serial presenter on climate science. To their credit, Fox News published that response in full, which was a bit surprising to me. In other news, Kyoto. So Peter and Marcy, his wife Marcy, and I recently saw a performance of the play Kyoto at the Lincoln Center in New York. Kyoto is a play about international negotiations to limit emissions of greenhouse gases. And it partly covers what I described to you at the beginning of today's presentation, what happened in Madrid in November 1995 in these discussions between climate scientists and government representatives about this infamous balance of evidence finding. I'm going to play for you, if this works, a very brief clip. This is roughly a minute and a half long from the Lincoln Center performance of Kyoto. I would encourage you to watch it if you can. Here's the brief clip, which is particularly poignant, I would say, given that COP30 in Brazil is now happening without any US involvement or federal involvement. Here's the brief clip.
Permit me to say the unsayable, Mr. Chairman. There is one country among us with less than 5% of the world's population responsible for over a third of its greenhouse gas emissions. It prides itself on world leadership, but has shown none at these talks. I am only sorry its distinguished delegate does not consider our survival a matter of substance.
Can it begin?
On second thoughts, Mr. Chairman, the conditional tense is no longer sufficient for us. Sea level rise will threaten survival.
Western Samoa rises first. They support Kiribati.
It will drown our crops.
Then the Republic of Nauru seconds this and won it in the minutes.
It will salinate our fresh water supplies.
Followed by Trinidad and Tobago, the Bahamas, Barbados, Bangladesh.
It will bleach our coral reefs and kill our mangrove forests.
Tanzania.
Stands with the island states. The developing world will no longer be brushed aside.
It will erode our coastlines. It will destroy our homes.
Mauritius, St. Lucia.
It will displace us from our land.
The Cook Islands, the
It
Maldives.
is displacing
The
us.
Federated States of Micronesia.
Drown in silence.
A tidal wave of resentments, old and new, flood the conference hall.
Again, I would strongly encourage you to
Commit.
see it if you have the opportunity. Let me just
Show no
get out of this.
at these talks, Mr.
First, they support Kiribati.
It will drown our crops.
Then
Permit me to say the unsaid.
I'm just trying to, here we go. So Kyoto was written by Joe Murphy and Joe Robertson. And one other piece of really good news is that they have been recognized as climate leaders in Time Magazine's recent list of the 100 climate leaders in the world for finding innovative ways to communicate about climate change science and efforts to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and describing that history, the history you just saw in that brief clip. I'm delighted that they've gotten this recognition. And it's interesting that Kyoto is the first play in a trilogy. So the two Joes are currently working on a play about the Conference of the Parties in Copenhagen in 2009. And the final play in the trilogy will be Paris and the Paris Climate Accords in 2015. I had the opportunity after watching Kyoto at the Lincoln Center with Peter and Marcy to participate in a talkback with the two Joes, Joe Murphy and Joe Robertson, our moderator, Karen Briscoe, and the actor who plays me, Daniel Jenkins. It's a pretty surreal experience to sit on stage with yourself and have a conversation about the play and storytelling and the importance of forming these partnerships between scientists and people who are really, really good at telling stories. Just finally, last slide here. In other news, Bill Gates, I'm sure many of you have read about this. Bill Gates recently on his website released a memo about climate change, and many climate scientists, myself included, were deeply upset because it was framed as an either-or choice. We can either lift people out of hunger and poverty and spend money on aiding the poor, or we can spend money on reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. That was sort of the frame that Mr. Gates set up, and that's an incorrect frame. Unfortunately, that frame that we really need to do a strategic pivot away from efforts to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases was picked up by others, predictably, like the president and many folks who don't want us to do anything about climate change. In my opinion, Mr. Gates has a special responsibility to carefully weigh everything he says before he goes public. He failed. He did not do that in this case, and setting up this straw man, we can either deal with climate change or hunger and poverty, we can't do both, is inherently wrong and flawed. The reality is that human-caused climate change is already and has already affected the poorest and most vulnerable all over the world and will continue to do so. The notion that these are two separate baskets or buckets that we need to deal with is false. So thanks very much for listening to me today. I'm sorry I went a little over, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very, very much. Most articulate presentation. And the recording is still recording, so we got it this time.
I forgot to show one final slide. Sorry about that. It's this one. I took this on a street in Aspen, and it sort of nicely summarizes where we are at the federal level in responding to climate change. Let's turn off measurements. Let's fire people. Let's shut down modeling capabilities. Let's not talk about it. Let's not use the words. Let's not listen to others. This is where we are at the federal level.
Sad but true.
Can we
Okay.
use that? Can we use that picture in other settings?
Of course.
Thank
Again,
you, Dr. Santer.
I took it on a street in Aspen, so I'm sure it's still there.
Okay. Those who need to leave, feel free. Excuse me. But those who want to stay, Ben is here. And let's see. Ray Welch has his hand up. Go for it, Ray.
I think I'm jumping in front of Bob here, but I have a very quick question for Ben. Ben, have you ever been on Joe Rogan?
No, I have not.
You might take a look at Dana Nucitelli's posting today or yesterday regarding some disinformation that was coming out of there a few days ago from a couple of what he describes as octogenarian climate deniers.
It was Lindsay.
And Joe Rogan, as you might know, has like 100 million followers, or maybe even more. He's widely regarded as the most influential podcaster in the United States. And he likes controversy, and he's kind of a libertarian flamethrower in some respects, but in other respects, he will countenance pushback just for the sake of controversy, because that's what he's in the business of selling. And so I think if you were to present some of this information, which is very clear on his podcast, he would have to listen to it. I think it might be a very powerful thing. So I would recommend looking at Dana's piece, and I can post that here in the chat for you.
It's in the Yale 360.
Yes, it's the Yale 360 thing. That's right.
Okay, Robert, then Stuart.
Thank you, Ray. Could I just respond briefly to that? Joe Rogan has provided a platform for a number of deniers over the years. One of them is Steve Koonin, who is one of the 5 authors of the DOE report. So back in 2021, Steve Koonin released a book entitled Unsettled, where Koonin's thesis was that the science of climate change is unsettled. And Koonin essentially launched his book tour on Joe Rogan. I'm not surprised that Joe Rogan has now given people like Dick Lindzen a platform. It's distressing that someone who has this kind of huge megaphone is allowing that megaphone to be handed over to people who have been shown to be wrong for decades. That's the concern here. And I don't know how to deal with it. I don't know how effective it is for someone like me to try to get onto a podcast like Joe Rogan, because it keeps the controversy going. Then that wouldn't be the end of it. Then there would be some rebuttal to Santer from some other set of skeptics. I don't know how to effectively deal with this asymmetry in the size of megaphones. I wish I did. I wish I had a good way of dealing with that.
Hi, Ben. First, a comment and a question. Thank you for concisely summarizing the Bill Gates piece. I have a sheet of paper on my wall with the definitions for straw man, red herring, false equivalence, conflation, cherry picking, error of omission, and post hoc fallacy, which is we see much too often. The question, that's a remarkable submission to DOE that you all did in that time frame. And I scanned it, which is all I'm capable of doing. Is there any way that or someone can extract really concise social media type points like you presented in this that can be used in letters to the editor, in social media, etc., out of that 400 pages? That can reach the lay person.
Thanks, Bob. That's a great question. I would assume that Andy Dessler, one of the two leaders of that response to the DOE, has put together something like that. I can take a look around and see whether Andy has something available. I know that Andy Dessler has a Substack channel, so I would be surprised if there weren't some high-level summary of the 400 plus page response to the DOE report in plain English on Andy's Substack channel.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Stuart, please.
Hey, thank you, Ben. That was mind-blowing, and I found it both simultaneously uplifting and disheartening. The disheartening, obvious. The uplifting, as a fellow scientist in a different field, the science will out. The science will prove itself to be accurate. And this brings up a question that I face when I present material like this, and that is urgency. So I'm a geoscientist, and we're trained to think in different timescales. How would you suggest presenting this type of dialogue and incorporating the urgency? Because this administration will last some period of time. This issue of denial will last some period of time. People will suffer, people will die, ecosystems will suffer. So how do we integrate that urgency in the message?
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer for you, Stuart. It's very frustrating as a scientist to have spent 30 years since the discernible human influence finding doing the science necessary to address these zombie arguments. Climate change is all natural, it's all the sun, it's all intrinsic variability, it's all volcanoes or some combination of the sun, volcanoes, and internal variability. We've looked at those hypotheses, they don't fit the bill. They don't describe what Manabe and Weatherall predicted back in 1967. We've kicked the tires. We've looked at uncertainties in models and satellite data, in weather balloon temperature data, you name it. We've done it as a community. And yet, here we are today in 2025, where that mature scientific understanding is fundamentally misrepresented in the DOE report. And again, it's so egregiously bad and wrong and embarrassing, which is what I don't understand. If you have any pretense that you're a scientist, how can you cherry pick and misrepresent? How can you say that's not day outside your window, that's night? How can you do that? And yet that's what's being done. And these are very powerful individuals. As I showed at the end, they seek not to have an educated judiciary. That's not what this administration wants. They don't want to have satellites measuring atmospheric temperature. They don't want to be measuring sea level rise or the emissions of methane and carbon. They want to literally fly the orbiting carbon observatory into Earth's atmosphere and destroy it. It's tough to wrap your brain around people who are destroyers. They don't want to understand. They don't want to build. They don't want to solve problems. They want to destroy. And that's what the play Kyoto tells so well, that short-term economic interests take precedence for these players on the other side, these forces of unreason. How one deals with the urgency question, that while they're fiddling and the planet is burning and all these terrible things are happening, the US is not at COP30. The US is not part of a community of nations working on solutions. There's so much that is bad and concerning politically. All I can do as an individual is to keep on talking about science and evidence and facts and the importance of making decisions on the basis of the best available scientific information. And I will do that in front of any audience, anywhere, anytime. Have laptop, will travel. But I don't know how we deal with, the fact that these forces of unreason now have some of the biggest megaphones in the world.
Do I see any other hands raised? I don't. Does anybody want to speak? Please feel free. If not, we will thank you,
Sure.
Ben.
I just think it's amazing that you got so much pushback. It just shows how powerful your message is.
Well, as I've said before, thank you. I'm in the end stages of my scientific career now. I'm an old dude. I'm going to be 71 next year. And when I look back over the last 30 years since Madrid, since the balance of evidence finding, I'm profoundly grateful. Yeah, sure, a lot of bad stuff has happened and likely will continue to happen. But I've had the extraordinary opportunity to work with brilliant women and men all around the world on issues that matter to all of us. That's privilege. I don't see myself as some victim. I see myself as someone who, when I get up in the morning, I have clear purpose. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this kind of thing. I'm going to try and mentor students. I'm going to try and encourage them to keep the embers of science alive, keep doing what they're doing. And I'm profoundly grateful for the fact that even as an old dude, I can still use my voice. No one has taken that privilege away from me yet.
And we are privileged to be able to hear you, Ben. Thank you very much. Alan Edmondson has his hand raised. Please, Alan. And then Deirdre.
Yeah, I see there's some questions in the chat, which I thought were good. Deidre's, I guess, is waiting to ask yours, so I won't get to that. But questions about who the people are besides our president who are attempting to take down the satellites or stop them from recording. Do you know, is that known who those are?
Let me just say that many members of the current administration have made on the record statements about climate science. Pete Hegseth, Secretary of War, climate science is quote unquote crap. Lee Zeldin, EPA administrator, announced his intention to drive a dagger through the heart of climate change religion. So for Mr. Zeldin, climate change is a religion. It's not facts. It's not science. The President of the United States, not far from the Lincoln Center, where Kyoto was playing, in his speech to the UN General Assembly very recently, referred to climate change as a, quote, con job, greatest hoax perpetrated on humanity. The administration is full of individuals who have fallen in line with President Trump's incorrect and ignorant views on the reality and seriousness of climate change. That's where we are. And unfortunately, the scientific enterprise in the US, particularly in the area of climate science, is being and will continue to be dismantled. NASA is facing serious cuts. Thousands of employees have been fired. Information has been removed from public-facing websites. Satellites are being turned off now. As I mentioned, in some cases, it's even being contemplated to not just turn off the satellites, but physically destroy them, fly them into the atmosphere. These things are insane. They make no sense whatsoever. Yeah, you're right, Ray. It's the high-tech equivalent of book burning. It's just like that final slide. We don't want to know. We don't want to see. We don't want to hear. We don't want to talk about stuff that is inconvenient. And evidence of human fingerprints on climate is inconvenient. Howard Lutnick, Secretary of Commerce in the Trump administration, cut the funding for the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab in Princeton University. Why? Mr. Lutnick's raison d'etre for doing that was that climate modelers are scaring America's youth. So that's where we are. There are folks who are doing, and I use this word advisedly, incalculable harm to our collective futures, to US standing in the world, to US science and technology, and they're doing it now. It's really important for everyone, in whatever way we can, to use our voices and speak out about the value of this information. What do we lose if I can't show you the kind of pictures I showed you today? What do we lose if we break the evidentiary chain and you can't see the warming of the troposphere and the cooling of the stratosphere, and you don't have the modeling capability to understand the climatic shape of things to come. What do we lose if we just embrace willful ignorance with open arms? That's what I want to talk about.
Deirdre, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Santer. It's always very sobering, and I think we all are incredibly grateful for the work that you've done. My question relates to Bill Gates and his releasing his memo. I'm wondering, do you have any idea what his motivation was? I mean, it doesn't really seem consistent with his prior positions.
I don't know what his motivation was releasing this memo on the eve of COP. As I mentioned, I think he has a special responsibility. He has a huge megaphone. He knew that whatever he was going to write, millions of people around the world were going to read it. And some, as I showed you, were going to seize on it gleefully and say, see, Bill Gates says climate change isn't a big problem, which is what the President of the United States did. Mr. Gates is not naive. He's a smart man. He must have known the consequences of going public and saying, this isn't the biggest problem we face. I've spent my scientific career studying interaction terms, the impacts of climate change, not only on our physical climate system, but also on people and on ecosystems. There are decades of research that look at those interaction terms, the impacts of climate change on agriculture, on energy resources, on human health. They're real, they're serious, which is why we had an endangerment finding from the EPA in 2009. Mr. Gates is setting this up as, we have one bucket of money and let's spend it on the most important stuff, which is lifting people out of poverty and improving health outcomes for them. But the notion that that is completely separate from climate change is false. It always was false. And Mr. Gates should know that. Climate change is the backdrop, the stage against which all other important geopolitical events of the 21st century are going to take place. Saying that this doesn't really matter, or we should do a strategic pivot away from efforts to reduce greenhouse gases, makes no sense to me whatsoever. And it's deeply worrying that Mr. Gates and other technological optimists believe that if the problem really is dire, we can engineer our way out of it. And he and others will be there willing to inject sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere to form synthetic volcanoes and cool the earth down. Elon Musk has recently gone on the record saying that, hey, my satellites, we can use them to reflect some portion of incoming sunlight. All of this makes me feel really uneasy. These are people, I think, who seek some sort of financial advantage from the problem. Selling satellites, being involved in geoengineering. Our energy should be focused on the difficult problem of reducing emissions of greenhouse gases if we really want to protect people and their lives and their health.
Well, welcome to Citizens Climate Lobby. That's exactly what we're trying to do. Ben, there's another question from Ron Riley, who is sitting on the edge of Mount Kilauea? What's it doing there, Ron?
Yeah, I just want to say, Dr. Santer, that was an amazing presentation, as was your August one. Living not that far from Mauna Loa and the Mauna Loa Observatory, I just wanted to say that it's so sad that people that we know right now are on furlough because of the shutdown, but they're also losing their funding because of the one big beautiful bill. And hopefully there's some way to get funding, maybe to get another site, because currently the 11,000-foot site is evidently federal land as designated back, I think, in 1950s to Dr. Keeling and his group. So maybe there's hope that we can continue the data that the Keeling curve is so internationally famous for. So just a comment, and thank you so much for all that you're doing.
Thank you for your kind words, Ron. And the notion that the Keeling curve, which has been called the most famous curve in geophysics, would go away, that we would stop measurements of atmospheric trace constituents at Mauna Loa, is insane. This is such a precious resource. We need to keep the evidentiary chain alive, to keep measuring, monitoring, understanding how and why our world is changing. We don't want to be on that bench, like this, and this. But that's what this administration seeks to do, and we have to call them out. Sadly, one of the consequences of this high-tech book burning, as I think it was Ray called it, is that other more enlightened countries are seriously considering now what their move is on the chessboard. They understand that the US is pulling back from investments in measuring and monitoring global climate. And if they want to keep the evidentiary chain alive, they will have to step up to the plate. They will have to up the ante in their remote sensing efforts. And that's happening. Those discussions are happening. China, Australia, the European Space Agency, sort of akin to what's happened in the defense arena with NATO. As the US has retreated, others are recognizing that it's their time to lead. Maybe that's a good thing, but if you're a US citizen, it's profoundly sad to see us take the baton of leadership and hand it off. We don't want to lead anymore. You lead. That's not the America that I grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the America that your father landed on Normandy beaches to defend either.
No, it's not.
Craig Preston, welcome.
Hi, Dr. Santer. Thank you. I'm Craig Preston in Costa Mesa and lead the action team in CCL for conservative outreach as we push for bipartisan legislation to fix a lot of things you've shared about. And thank you for your data and your years of service. We're in a tough time here. We reform ourselves each 2 years for the Congress we're given. Obviously, we all vote and try to form the Congress we would like, but then we deal with the one we're given. And I think we're unique in a way that there's protesters outside, there's paid lobbyists inside, and there's unpaid lobbyists inside. And that's a rare thing that we have built a network around the country to do. There's even controversy within CCL of what do we do next? Do we keep fighting for a carbon fee and dividend? Do we keep greasing the slide to build this bipartisan legislation bill by bill? We've gotten about 9 bills passed, but obviously we need much more. Next Saturday will be a display, as Peter mentioned, of our next thoughts on where we go, permitting reform and Fix Our Forest Act and things like that. Dr. Hansen, I've been following lately, and he used to end his presentation saying, what you can do is join CCL. He doesn't do that anymore because he's doggedly dedicated to carbon fee and dividend, and we've shifted to kind of grease the slide on smaller bills, hoping to get back to carbon pricing. But I know you're a scientist. Sometimes I ask scientists these questions and they say, that's your job to go build political will. You guys do the science. But would love your insight on that of, would you encourage people to join CCL, or would you encourage them to do CF&D? Would you encourage them to grease the slide for smaller bills? In some ways, I feel like we're on the Titanic and the boat is sinking. So there's times when do we just load the lifeboats?
Well, thank you, Craig, for that question. And you're right. I'm not an expert on the optimal economic strategies for responding to climate change. But I spent a lot of time talking to Peter and Bob Archer and others who are incredibly knowledgeable and have spent years of their lives trying to understand the levers of power. How can we most effectively deal with the problem of human-caused climate change? And this gets back to that earlier question about urgency. It is urgent. In my lifetime, we've identified a human-caused climate change signal that's emerged from the background noise of natural climate variability. Last year was the largest increase in atmospheric CO2 that we've monitored, 3.5 parts per million. The signal is only going to ratchet up. It's going to affect every aspect of our lives. It's going to affect sea level. It's going to affect intense rainfall. It's going to affect the properties of heat waves, intensity, frequency, duration. It's going to affect hurricanes, everything. We don't have the luxury of time for the small bills that you referred to. I think what's necessary now is to convince people in any way we can that this is your future, this is your kids' future, this is whether they're going to live on a healthy planet or not. And everything we can do now to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, every mechanism we can set in motion, that's what we need to be doing. The strategic pivot away from Bill Gates is insane. We don't have the luxury of being able to do that strategic pivot. People are already dying. More people will die. Look at the speech in Kyoto from the woman from Kiribati. Their lives are already being profoundly affected by what we've done. So it's not the time for small measures. And Peter and Bob Archer and others have convinced me that the most effective levers of power are carbon fee and dividend. And we need to use those levers of power. And we need to figure out ways of convincing folks on the other side that we don't have the luxury of being able to continue business as usual emissions. And hey, if things get really bad, then we'll turn to Elon Musk and Bill Gates and engineer our way out of all of this stuff. No, the idea that we can somehow magically counteract the climate harms we're already causing by geoengineering, I fundamentally disagree with that. I think that what we need to be doing now with urgency and with every lever of power we can access is reduce emissions of greenhouse gases.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? Al, do you have anything to wrap up you would like to say?
Well, just reiterate the thanks, Dr. Santer, for joining us today and for his unwavering commitment to making sure that the public is getting the right information about the science. Takes a lot of courage to continue to wage that battle in the current environment, and so we're all very appreciative of those efforts. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Alan. I'm very appreciative of your efforts. You devote significant time and energy to trying to find dialogue, to trying to find common ground. And I'm profoundly grateful to all of you for doing that. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you today. That gave me the chance to put together all of this information. I did not have those timelines, the two timelines that I presented, the timeline for the DOE report and the timeline for the serial presenter stuff. And it's been valuable for me to put those timelines down. I will use them again in other presentations because it's important to understand the sequencing here. And hopefully there will be an update. The DOE report, as I mentioned, is still out there. It hasn't been withdrawn. The EPA is likely to try and rescind the endangerment finding. So these timelines are important to preserve and understand for all of us. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about this stuff.
Well, Ben, my friend, thank you. We know you're busy, and your dedication to this is just absolutely remarkable. I wish there were more people like you doing this work. So we thank you deeply, and I will make this recording available on the CCL website. I'll send you a copy. And if there are no other questions or comments, we'll say goodbye to you and call the meeting to a close. So thank you again.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone.
Goodbye.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you,
Have a
Ben.
nice weekend.
Peter, with the video on, will you also be able to put the slides on? The
Your slides,
presentation?
Ben? What about your slides? Is there a package that you could make available?
I'm happy to send my slides to you. They're all in the public domain. The only thing I'm a little uncertain about is the YouTube video, whether we have permission to share that. But the slides, happy to share them with you, Peter.
You'll be interested to know that on yesterday's The World on PBS radio, they covered Kyoto. They had an article about it. It was quite good. And I saw it in New York. It was the best theater production I've ever seen in my life. And I've spent a lot of time in New York going to theater. It's terrific. And I certainly hope it gets legs, comes out here to maybe Berkeley rep or the Harvard rep or wherever it's going to go. I wish they'd make a movie out of it because it would be a good movie. It's a very exciting theater. So anyone, if you ever get a chance to see Kyoto, do so. All right.
All right. Thank
Bye,
you,
everybody. Thanks
Bye.
for coming.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.